Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications and your podcast co-host. Well, this week we got a major decision from the U.S. Supreme Court on Friday morning when the court effectively struck down President Trump's use of what he claimed to be sweeping abilities to impose tariffs around the world. And the court, basically ruled that it's Congress that is able to exercise a lot of these powers, not the president. So it's to break down the ruling and kind of go through what the impact will be and where do we go from here. We thought, who better to have on than the person who's been the number one guest on the PRI Next Round podcast, our friend, PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, Wayne Winegarden. Wayne, how are you today?
Well, I'm feeling great. I'm the number one guest.
That's right. Yes, we added it up once, and by far you're the number one guest on Next Round. So, in thinking about this ruling, maybe it's best to start with kind of a 30,000-foot view. Exactly what did the court rule in their decision in the case? How did we get here?
Yeah. And I think it's important to know when we start thinking about this that the president has been instituting tariffs using lots of different justifications. Now, the biggest justification he's been using is what's called, we refer to as IEEPA, which refers to like economic emergency. And he essentially was claiming that the trade deficit was constituting, or the persistent trade deficit was constituting an emergency, and that he could then impose tariffs. And what was great for him about this is that gave him a lot of flexibility to impose tariffs of all sorts of rates on all of these different countries. So it was a little bit of a carte blanche, him taking on the power of being able to impose tariffs at his whim. And what the Supreme Court said, like you just said, it said, no, the IEEPA legislation does not give you this really just random power to impose tariffs as you want. And so all of the tariffs, about over the past a little bit over a year, we've collected about $300 billion in tariff revenues, about $175 billion, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. Of that was the tariffs imposed on the IEEPA. Those are now gone. And this flexible kind of ability for the president to just willy-nilly throw down tariffs, that power has been declared unconstitutional. He never had that power. And so a good portion, almost 2/3 of the tariffs that were imposed by dollar volume are now gone.
So we've talked and written about and talked with legal scholars, and we've done a lot of analysis of the president's tariff proposals when they were first introduced and in their initial months of being implemented. So given all that you've been thinking and writing about these tariffs, were you surprised by the court's ruling?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, when I'm surprised, it should have been a 9-0 ruling. And after the kind of oral arguments, it was clear to all of the Supreme Court observers that this is the way the court was going to go. And, it just, the logic of it, where was the emergency, first of all, right? I mean, a trade deficit that's existed for decades is not an emergency, but that's not actually how the court decided. What they actually decided that the legal question at play was, under this legislation, was the president authorized to impose tariffs? Because, again, and we can get too far into the weeds here, but basically, based on the language, he has the ability to regulate physical imports. That's, in effect, the authority Congress granted to the president. Because remember, in the Constitution, it's Congress that has the power to levy taxes, to impose tariffs, all of these things. And so they gave a slight authority under emergency situations, because sometimes you just can't get, all of these Congress people together to make a decision quickly. So when that's needed, you can block physical imports. And essentially what it's saying is, go back in history, right? We're at war with Imperial Japan. We're not going to have imports of Japanese products into the U.S. So the president's authorized to block those imports. Extreme version, but that's in effect what the AIPA kind of gives to the the president. He doesn't have the ability to levy tariffs. That's what the ruling was. That's what was expected after the oral hearings. And quite frankly, from an economic perspective, it's a really good ruling as well.
Well, and some of the facts of the case or the justifications as they laid them out, well, it's not the reality of what was happening. One of the justifications I know for the various tariffs against Canada was the fentanyl crisis and,
Right.
drugs supposedly pouring across the border. But, pick up a newspaper, listen to any Canadian government official. When that was the justification levied for those tariffs, they've done and, shown with their actions, they're willing to do whatever it takes to help curb the fentanyl crisis and address the president's concerns.
Oh, absolutely. And, in the trade deficit issue, and you're right, fentanyl was a big justification the president was using. But on trade deficit, if that's an emergency, why are we putting tariffs on countries that we have a trade surplus with? So there was all this hypocrisy going on. It's not actually why the Supreme Court ruled what they did, but there was just a tremendous amount of hypocrisy that just wasn't actions inconsistent with what they were saying. So that from that perspective, this is a really important ruling as well.
Now, how has the president responded to this? I mean, and I guess when I ask that question, there's kind of two responses. There's what we might predict he would say in his press conferences and tweets and press statements about the ruling. And then there's also the administration's actual response to the rulings. So what have been both of those?
Well, I would say you're probably better off on the first one in terms of what the responses were. I mean, it's been vitriol,
it did not
right?
disappoint. Let's just say that it was. If you were if you followed Donald Trump and you were to predict he might have an angry, boisterous response, he did not disappoint in his public utterances.
Good TV. But in terms of the policy wise, and this is going to be very controversial too, but he basically used again, focusing on the trade deficit, he used authority that he has from a 1974 Trade Act to have a 15% across the board tariff. Now, this authority gives him the ability to impose those tariffs for up to 150 days. And then after 150 days, those 15% tariffs are going to go away. Now, it didn't need to be as high as 15%. He originally announced 10% on Friday. And then over the weekend, it just suddenly popped up to 15%. But this again is going to be legally dubious. It will be going to court. I would imagine the one reason we may not ever get any legal decision is it's 150 days. So unless somebody stays it, unless a court stays these tariffs, by the time we get a decision, a half a year is going to go by, and so the tariffs will expire well before we probably get any type of legal kind of decision on this, or that's the possibility that it will. But the basic response was, well, you're going to take away these tariffs. Well, I'm going to impose tariffs pretty close to the same level that was actually ultimately applied across the board. I'm going to impose those over here under this justification. And then he's still searching for other justifications. So he keeps using different powers that have been granted, and he's trying to stretch them to get as many different tariffs implemented, even though the court says you really don't have that power under, it was under one reading. But, I imagine if we litigated them all, we would find the same thing, that he's abusing the power that's been granted to presidents across the board. We only have the decision on one, but I would imagine we're going to find the same thing if they ever made it back up to the Supreme Court for these others.
So certainly if you're a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional scholar, you're going to be very busy in the coming months as we debate all of these issues. It seemed also, too, the other kind of thing at play here is with all these debates over tariffs, we've had a lot of discussions with the European Union, with the UK, with Japan, other countries about potential new trade deals. How did the president's new announcement affect those? Were these universal 15% tariffs that he adopted? Did he have different rules for people people who he's far down the line with in terms of negotiating new, in his mind, better trade deals for the U.S.?
No, because he doesn't have the flexibility. That's why they wanted to use the IEEPA tariffs. That gave a lot more flexibility. And I imagine, I mean, in some ways, it doesn't impact things because I think a lot of the agreements were more kind of on paper, never going to actually occur. So in the ultimate impact, you could say it won't be that impactful in the sense that, all of the, what did he say, $8 trillion of investments or whatever that number he came up with is, that was never going to occur anyway. But we are accelerating that. But we know for a fact, looking at the EU, right, they haven't signed the trade deal yet. And now they're not proceeding because there's all sorts of uncertainty. I mean, these countries don't want to sign a trade agreement when the other party to the agreement, us, can't commit to anything. So, we've now slapped 15% tariffs on the EU, even though we had a trade agreement that was going to be signed. Was on kind of process to being signed. But we're now being erratic. And so they're not following through because who knows if we're going to be able to follow through on our side of whatever the agreement was. So it really creates a lot more volatility. The fact that he didn't just say, okay, I don't have the authority to impose these tariffs. I will either A, get it done properly, which means get Congress to approve it, or B, stop with his harmful policy. And by the way, option B is the best. But because he didn't do that, we've now inserted a tremendous amount of additional uncertainty. And so all of that's going to be impacting kind of how things are going to go going forward. And that's going to be a pall hanging over the economy.
So if you've had months and months of illegally now collected tariffs, well, there must be refunds issued at some point or another, and now we have kind of the battle over refunds, and it's taking two different forms. So first, if you're Canada or the UK or the European Union, if you're one of the companies that's been affected in the industries where the now illegal tariffs have been issued, how are refunds going to go? Do you present a bill to the United States government? Is this going to be litigated? How's that going to go? And what would the impact be on the deficit and the federal budget with the amount of refunds that, we've seen the president, trumpet all this money that he's collecting in tariffs. Well, it seems now that we've lost that overnight.
Yeah, we have. I mean, the proper policy is that the companies should get their money back. And I think if we do kind of a analogous situation, imagine President Trump imposed a 10% surtax on everybody's income. He didn't get congressional approval. He just put a 10% income surtax on anybody who files a tax return. And we all paid it. And we paid $175 billion in total to the federal government. Well, we undoubtedly, if the Supreme Court ruled that was illegal, that he wasn't allowed to, we would demand and expect refunds. And, quite frankly, the IRS processes refunds every year. And so, the government certainly knows how to pay a refund. And in fact, in court, in arguments, the administration argued that paying refunds would not be difficult. Part of the reason why the whole thing wasn't stayed is the argument that the administration could easily pay refunds. So, from a kind of a brother process perspective, and I think from a theoretical perspective, these companies paid $175 billion that was not authorized. It was I don't know if I should say illegal tax in the sense that there's specific legal connotations, but certainly it was an unauthorized tax, and they are entitled to that refund. And it will be litigated. The administration has clearly stated that they are not going to be voluntarily paying these refunds, and so we'll have to see how that plays out. There's already litigation out there, and mind you, by the way, it's small businesses that are harmed the most by paying all these costs that were unauthorized, and certainly the ones in the least position, right, in the worst position, to be able to demand that they get those refunds back. So so there is definitely a small business angle on this, that they're going to be paying. They're at the most risk. But from a federal deficit perspective, we now have $175 billion in additional expenditures. Whether that's going to be in this budget year, over the next couple, or wherever that comes, if we do what's right and we find the money, then that's, we booked it as revenue in previous years. Now we got to book it as an expense in order to net that out. And so our deficits will be that much larger. We'll have higher interest costs on the debt because we'll have to issue more debt unless the Congress, which they shouldn't, but unless they pass a tax increase. That's just the arithmetic consequence of doing this. But the bottom line is that there was an unprecedented power grab by the administration. It was slapped down, and this is just the unprecedented response to that unprecedented situation.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week. So then there's the political theater side of the rebates, and we've seen Governor Gavin Newsom, of course, because he can't help himself, and Governor J.B. Pritzker of Illinois kind of followed his line. Governor Pritzker sent a letter to the president demanding a $1,700 refund for every family in Illinois, which, according to his math, there's about 5.1 million households in Illinois, so that would be about an $8.6 billion bill. And he is saying, that everyone's owed a refund for the impact on farmers and grocery prices and all of that. What do you think of that demand? Are they onto something here, or is this just a political stunt that isn't really helpful right now?
It's a political stunt that's not helpful. I mean, I think the only logical way of refunding it is paying, giving the money back to the people who cut the check. Undoubtedly, economists always talk about the burden and incidence of the tax versus, who physically writes the check. And, in some instances, some costs will push forward, but, not in all instances, and who consumed it. I mean, you're getting into very difficult areas. And so you're going to end up doing a huge redistribution of income, which just is not warranted. I mean, the bottom line is you want to give the money back to the person who cut the check, and then competitive pressures. You'll see, some prices will come down in some areas through the competition, others it won't. But you also have to remember that in a lot of instances, the companies didn't directly raise prices. They, reduced their income or cut expenditures elsewhere or had lower profits. So, in some instances, they themselves are the ones that bore the incident. So you really can't get into that question of, we think this person paid it versus that person. It's too complicated. It's and in a way, there's something analogous to income taxes, right? Where you could say, well, actually, my salary was a little higher, in order to cover the taxes. So the check should go to the companies. I mean, I think people would laugh at that and be offended by that. But it's the same logic they're trying to use, and it just doesn't apply. Refunds are due, but they should just go back to the companies that paid it.
So we've talked about what the president isn't able to do based on these legal rulings. What are some of the things the president could do legally using his executive powers on this issue? I know in his press conference and in his public utterances, we've heard some things that might make us shudder, like trade embargoes. What are some of the things, if he wanted to, what has been recognized as lawful use of his executive power, what are some of the things he could do?
I mean, if you do a strict interpretation, nothing, right? I mean, what could he do? He could use the power of the bully pulpit to convince Congress to impose the tariffs on the specific countries that he wants for, reasons, and have a kind of exactly the way the founders designed it. That, if we're going to impose taxes on the people, and tariffs are taxes on people of the United States, we need to have the Congress debate it. And if the people's representatives are convinced of it, and they are, they're directly responsible to their constituents, then we can impose it. Same thing with, we want to embargo a certain country, but we're not, in a direct conflict type situation. I mean, there's all sorts of crazy things happening, and we do have issues with China and Iran, and but those aren't the policies we're talking about. We're talking about embargoes on Japan or the EU or Australia or Taiwan, or tariffs on those countries. That's really what he's trying to do. And if that's what he wants to do, it is absolutely the wrong policy. But his authority is to go to Congress and convince them, the people's representatives, why that is the right policy for the country, and have the debate. All of these other things are simply games, and he's driving a Mack truck through kind of a hole, trying to make this loophole much bigger than it is. I mean, take the 150-day tariffs that he's imposed, right, through Section 122. He's basically misinterpreting an economic concept, right? He's saying that we have a trade deficit, but a trade deficit isn't why that authority was given to the president. It's actually an anachronistic authority that goes back to kind of when we were on the gold standard. And it's talking about balance of payments, which really is getting at the idea of, can you get the financing? And when you have a fixed exchange rate, there's a lot of international trade transactions that are different. But those are the issues that it's dealing with. It's not dealing with a trade deficit. And I know that the terms deficit are similar and things get confusing, but it's a misuse of kind of that kind of authority. And in fact, what, Congress should actually remove that authority, because it's no longer relevant to today's economy. And that's just that example. Each one of the examples that you could actually kind of work through, that supposedly he has the authority to impose a tariff or impose an embargo or prevent imports from a certain country. Any one he uses, it's going to be kind of a misapplication of that rule, because that justification just doesn't apply at the current moment.
So we're talking about Congress. Obviously, Congress has a big role here. What should Congress be doing right now?
I mean, one, they should repeal Section 122 of the 1974 Act, like I just said. I mean, that there's just no reason that we still have that. It's not an issue. They should also they should more explicitly define these terms in terms of national security, unfair trade practices in these different acts, to make it clear, even clearer than it is now, what the presidential authority is. What they could do is they could have a vote on the tariffs, in terms of either saying we're against them, or even having a vote that says, okay, what if we propose this tariff? And if all the majority of Congress people voted it down, then the people's representatives are on record saying, I'm for or against tariffs. And when we vote in the midterms, we'll actually know that. And we could then kind of, again, this is how democracy is supposed, a representative government is supposed to work. And we can then vote for those representatives who are for our position. And hopefully, and I think presumably, they would actually vote for those who are against these tariffs, because Congress has made it very clear in their actions that they're not in favor of levying these tariffs. So I think they could do all of these things that would, tighten the definitions of his authority, narrow the authority so that there's not these big loopholes. They could get rid of the sections that are just anachronistic, like Section 122 of the 1974 Act, and they could actually make it clear that they're against tariffs. And I think if they sent those signals, and I'm talking the way they should be voting, in my view, if they did all of that, that would actually do a lot to creating greater business certainty, knowing that tariffs aren't going to be imposed, removing that authority, or that perceived authority, so businesses have that type of predictability. And that would do a lot to encourage more investment, to encourage more economic activity, and could really help get the economy moving again, which, given the fourth quarter GDP report, it seems like it could be very important.
So we've talked a lot about businesses. We've talked a lot about government. We haven't talked a lot about consumers. What impact, if any, will consumers see as a result of this ruling?
Well, I mean, I think the ruling right off the bat is going to remove a big chunk of cost increases that were beginning to pass through, right? I mean, one of the things that we had seen is some, but not a lot of the costs had been directly passed through. Consumers were paying it in other ways, but directly passed through to prices. But, the fear was that, that those were coming. And remember, there's still a good number of tariffs out there that hadn't been repealed because of the Supreme Court's decision. So those costs would be coming, but they're going to be less. And that's a good thing. But going forward, right, by not having those costs, it'll help with the affordability issues that consumers are dealing with, because one, it'll be lessened slightly. That's a good thing. But two, a huge increase that was going to worsen it isn't going to be coming. It's not something we may obviously directly observe, but it is something that we avoided, a really bad thing that we avoided. So those are all benefits that consumers are going to get. The other benefit that consumers could get, and I say could because, again, the 15% tariff in response is muting these benefits, is that by repealing this, we are creating some clarity. We are removing some tariffs, a good amount of them, I should say. And so that is going to be positive for the economy. And so there was that potential, we were just talking about growth impacts from reducing these tariffs. Those should have been coming from this decision. And again, I'm equivocating on this because those benefits have been undercut by the 15% tariff that he responded. So if we think about the benefits from the Supreme Court versus what we're actually seeing, by repealing it, there was all this positive kind of growth that could have been coming. We're just losing it because of the 15% response. But those were all benefits that consumers should be seeing from this decision.
How will farmers be impacted by the ruling?
Well, farmers, again, there was a great opportunity for them to kind of get that international trade back on track. I mean, you got to remember, farmers export a lot of, agricultural products. There's a lot of revenue that comes overseas, and they've actually lost a lot of business. Soy farmers, China being the example we've talked about again and again and again since these tariffs were impacted, and they've lost not just the current business, but they've also lost a lot of goodwill with their trading partners and with consumers overseas, right? So that the people are not as or more kind of, I guess the right term is, suspicious of consuming kind of U.S. products, or the more reticent to consuming U.S. agricultural products, and they're going to have to overcome that. This decision again could have been helpful toward that, to creating kind of reigniting those relationships. What it doesn't do, obviously, is directly reduce the trade barriers that were raised in response. But again, if we can get through this tumultuous times in terms of the presidential response, perhaps it can get us on that path to getting kind of the barriers to our exports reduced. And that would be good for farmers. The other thing it does for farmers, and we don't talk about this enough, is that farmers import a lot of supplies in the process, a lot of fertilizers, other types of inputs into their kind of production, right, of agricultural goods. Those costs have gone up because of the imports. Well, the removing of these tariffs reduces those costs, and that's beneficial for farmers. So the potential is great. Again, it's the same type of, well, we're getting tariffs on in another way in the near term. And so that's, countervailing. But the decision itself is beneficial for farmers. And assuming that, in 6 months, when the 150 days is over, if no new tariffs come on, we could then start reaping those benefits then. We being consumers, we being businesses, we being farmers.
So last question, despite all the bluster from the president and all the hot tempers and different corporate office suites and capitals around the world, what should be the ideal trade policy that Congress and the president are embracing these days?
I mean, it's the same that we've had. It's free trade. It's not obstructing kind of our ability to consume the best products at the best possible prices. Kind of the amount of trade that, as that increases, the kind of our welfare increases, our economic vibrancy increases, the number of jobs in the U.S. increases. The more we engage, the better off we all are, and that hasn't changed. Now, certainly there were issues that needed to be dealt with. A lot of that is internal policies to kind of improve education, to improve opportunities domestically, kind of addressing the entitlements and spending and excessive taxes and excessive regulations, and all of that needs to be addressed as well in concert. But it was those things that were reducing opportunity in this country. It wasn't free trade. And so we had our tariffs down to, I think the average was like 1%, if not lower, on the average tariff. And we need to get back to that. And if we can get back to that, then we can kind of regain kind of the benefits we were all receiving from this kind of robust global trading system. And then we need to then get to work and address the actual problems that middle class families are feeling, so that we can kind of get, again, that kind of prosperity and kind of that feeling about the American dream. And we can reinvigorate that. But we need to reinvigorate that correctly, which is address the policy obstructions that are actually responsible for the problems people are feeling.
Well, Wayne, as always, I think our listeners learned a lot going through everything they wanted to know about tariffs and didn't know they needed to learn about. So thank you for joining us once again.
Oh, thanks. I always enjoy being here.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.